Ever since it was first announced as Gods and Monsters at E3 2019, this game, now called Immortals Fenyx Rising, was my most anticipated game of all 2020. Go ahead, listen to our podcast from about a year ago, check the tapes, it's all there. And of course, the reason I was so excited about this game was that whether intentionally or not, it had the potential to scratch the itch left by Breath of the Wild after I played it at launch, and it quickly became my favorite game of all time. So a few weeks back, I reached out to Ubisoft in hopes to get a review code, and I'm very excited to be able to share with you this Breath of the Wild fanboy's impressions of Immortals Fenyx Rising. Let's talk about it. So since we don't really do traditional reviews here on fanatixfour, I didn't really do a traditional review playthrough either. Going into the playthrough of the game, I knew that I was going to make this video and of course want to talk about the merits of the game on its own, but was also going to use Breath of the Wild as a starting point. Meaning that I didn't beeline the story beats and try to get to the end as quickly as possible, because that's not how I would play either of those games, and probably not how you would either. Instead, I explored the world, and if I saw something shiny off in the distance, I'd go follow that and see where it leads. I think the reason I preface that will be clear throughout the video, but on that note, let's talk about the game. I think the first thing to focus on is the same the game does. It kicks you into the action quite quickly, which I'm always a big fan of, but it does start with story. The whole game is told from a semi-omniscient conversation between two Greek gods as they narrate Fenyx's journey to, you know, beat some bad guys and stuff. This narrative style reminds me of two games that I played recently, Bastion by the same developers as Hades, and Raji, an ancient epic. And I actually been really enjoying this storytelling tool. The game is full of references to these ancient Greek myths, but the nuance of these weird and wacky ancient Greek stories may be kind of lost in just contextual storytelling, so it's assisted really well with actual exposition. The fact that this is told as a conversation also allows for some witty banter that I appreciate. But of course, this narration is only during story moments or interesting landmarks. So when you're exploring the world, you'll be left to your own devices, but as soon as you stumble on an area with some mythology, you'll get some flavorful context. Fenyx, however, isn't devoid of character. You can customize their look, but this is not a silent protagonist situation. Fenyx can't hear the narration of the gods, but will interact with some pivotal NPCs. I will say though that unless this changes later in the game, there are a distinct lack of NPCs that aren't story-based. The game explains it away contextually, but I really enjoyed Hitano Village and Breath of the Wild, so it's a shame not to have that layperson's villager's opinions on the calamity at hand. It's really not a huge thing, but it would have been nice. After an opening cutscene or two and you create a character, you finally take control of Fenyx, and the first thing I noticed is actually the HUD. This is a small note, but I really appreciate that you can fully customize what's included in your field of vision at all times. I liked playing with Breath of the Wild's Pro HUD that only had health and stamina, but at times it might have been nice to have a bit more distinct customization, and Immortals Fenyx Rising gives that to you. The biggest decision to make, I would say, is whether you want to be guided to your next task or not. I prefer to explore, and having a marker that tells me where to go kind of breaks that, so obviously I turned it off. I just think this freedom allows the player as much information as they need, but not more than they want, which is a great balance. So far, these are things that I think are very important to the game, but let's get to the actual gameplay. Of course, one very key part of any game like this is the combat. As you'll see in my gameplay, this is one area that shares some similarities with Breath of the Wild, but for the most part is different. Although the root of a lot of mechanics are related, the execution tends to feel a bit more arcadey, for a lack of a better term. And this isn't to its detriment, whereas for one player this may feel less immersive, for another it may be more fun. So one practical example of this that isn't in the combat but is kind of indicative of what sorts of changes you can expect. So whereas in Breath of the Wild you can't whistle for your horse if they're too far away, in this game you can call up your mount immediately from pretty much anywhere. It's not necessarily realistic, but I think it's leaning more into practicality and fun than realism. How this plays out in combat is that, for one thing, weapons don't break. You do find new weapons during the game, but the system seems more predetermined, I guess. Like, this one chest will always have a certain weapon. This probably helps keep the game more balanced, especially since you can get better weapons throughout a playthrough. I found though that like I would tailor my combat style around having different weapons in Breath of the Wild, the same can be true here. Each piece of gear has different buffs or abilities that I'll use and sometimes even switch between within a single fight. For example, I've got a helmet that does 160% more damage on the first hit to an enemy, so I like to wear it, do the strongest hit I can, then change that headgear to one that buffs my combo finishers. I also have armor that lets me regain health when I stun an enemy. Stun is a meter under their health bar that strong attacks will build up over time. So I like to save small enemies for health regeneration since I can stun them quickly. All in all, the combat's really enjoyable, and the way that the gear is integrated makes me adapt my playstyle fairly often. I'm also looking forward to unlocking new abilities throughout the game that'll change up the way I fight even more. This is something absolutely worth talking about. Just about everything can be upgraded. For example, your individual swords don't have their own attack power, but your swords as a whole do. This is why each piece of gear has abilities based on percentages or buffs like one additional health chunk so that they can scale. You upgrade your gear with the currency found in chests from beating enemies or just found around the world. You upgrade your health bar with ambrosia, which is just a collectible found here and there, generally in interesting locations. You upgrade your stamina with Zeus's lightning, which is found in vaults, and hold on to that, I'll get to vaults in just a minute. And you can gain complete new abilities with coins gained either from tasks you can do, like kill this number of this variety of enemies, or from mythical trials found around the world. These trials are things like perform Odysseus's shot through the hilt of 12 axes, or run from this spot to this other spot in a certain time window like Achilles, or solve this puzzle. These feel sort of similar to the Korok challenges in Breath of the Wild. They're fairly seamlessly integrated into the world and are short challenges that on their own may not mean as much as a one-off, but come together to allow you to upgrade your character in a fun way and help build the world as a whole. One last thing I'll say about upgrades, there is an actual online store, which is something that worried me a bit at first, but turns out it was kind of a non-issue. I was worried the online store would mean that the game could get grindy at some times, resulting in pushing you to spend real money instead. But so far, it just seems like the store is a way to get some gear for real money that's probably just better from the get-go and will speed up your playtime. For someone like me, that's completely the opposite of what I'd want to do in the first place, but it's also not invasive at all, so really seems to be only there for people that want it. Overall, the upgrade system's pretty good, and it feels like there's always something that I can be working towards, even if I want to just ignore the story for a while. And now, remember when I mentioned vaults? Vaults are pretty much this game's equivalent to shrines. Their aesthetic is uniform, you can't climb most walls, whereas you can climb anything else you want to in the main game. They consist of some puzzles or combat. Their end goal is part of an upgrade to your stamina, and there's always at least one extra chest if you can figure out how to do an additional challenge. My one complaint with these is there are a few that seem to require upgrades that aren't available from the start. So by contrast to the shrines in Breath of the Wild, where as soon as you get off the Great Plateau, every shrine is technically possible from the get-go, there are some vaults that just seem to require some upgrades that you might not have unlocked yet, so you might need to go get that unlock and then come back. It's not a huge issue, but it might slow down your pace a little bit. And you can always tell which vaults you visited but haven't actually completed, so it's easy to go back, fast travel to them as soon as you get the unlock, and go from there. All in all, there's not a ton to say about the vaults other than some may be easy or hard, fun or annoying, and everything in between. But it's a system I appreciated in Shrines, and I like it here too. One of my favorite parts in Breath of the Wild was all the systems that were always seamlessly in play. Tons of items to collect, to cook into new items, a system where fire, ice, water, and electricity worked in consort. Your temperature mattered, your volume mattered, and everything else. At its heart, as well as an adventure and action game, it was a survival game. This is something that fairly early on in Immortals Fenyx Rising, I had to realize and accept was one huge difference. Once again, it's not to the game's detriment, but I had to learn, for example, not to expect dozens of different items to have to collect, but rather just the ingredients for health, stamina, defense, and attack potions, and the collectibles for upgrades. And I'm glad I realized this earlier on in the game because it allowed me to focus on what the game is trying to do rather than what it's not and doing worse. It's just designed with a different intention. And one of the main things it is doing is exploration. Especially once you get to the second area, this is a really beautiful game, even on the lower powered Switch. It focuses on style rather than graphical fidelity, which translates down really well on this hybrid console, while obviously looking really good on the next-gen systems as well. But to me, I always appreciate a good draw distance, and this is a game that's designed that when you're looking out over the landscape, you can always see something that's interesting that you may want to set your sights on, even if a bunch of trees in that area will need to appear before you get over there or something. Also, even when I fought multiple enemies at a time, the performances felt really great to me. No hiccups or anything that I've noticed. I'm sure the other consoles look even better, but if you're looking to play it on the Switch, it's a perfectly passable technical experience.
I played my first 2 hours or so of Immortals Fenyx Fenyx Rising on Switch in handheld mode, and for the most part, I feel similarly to Parker in terms of performance on Switch. But I spent the bulk of my time with the game on Xbox Series X. The graphics are noticeably better. More importantly, in my opinion though, the draw distance and frame rate are as well, but not any more than I'd expect with a jump in hardware like that. Also, I will add that I like the Xbox Series and honestly Xbox One controller more than I do the Switch Pro controller, so take that for what you will. That said, none of that would honestly deter me from the Switch version. If anything, it'd only make me want to double dip, because to me, the most impressive thing about Immortals Fenyx Rising is its cross-platform features. Sending and loading my game save across the two versions of the game only served to increase my desire for some sort of souped up dock or Switch Home equivalent, because playing a game like this in handheld mode would be hard for me to pass up, and I'd miss that more than I would the increase in visual fidelity or even higher and more stable frame rates. But having access to both through this cross progression feature is really nice for the rare times when I just want to look at something more pretty. By no means would I recommend that to everyone, but if you feel similarly to me or are typically the type to rebuy a game on Switch for the option to play portably, this game does it better than most others, since you can pass your save back and forth throughout your playthrough. All of that is technical mumbo jumbo, and that's good, but I have thoughts on the game itself. However, in the interest of time, I'll save those for this week's episode of our podcast directly to you, which will feature Xeon from Nintendo Life, who has been playing Immortals Fenyx Rising as well, so feel free to ask any and all questions you have about the game for all of us to answer in the comments down below.
The last thing I want to comment on is that, as AJ and I have chatted about on our own, this game seems to intentionally try to fix all of the common issues that players found with Breath of the Wild. I think for me, in some areas, this leads to a slightly less interesting experience. For someone else, it might be the exact fix to a mechanic that you hated so that you can finally enjoy a game like this. For example, weapons don't break, as we already talked about. There's also no weather cycle, so you won't slip in the rain or get hit by lightning. There's a lot more direct story rather than the story through memories. And so far, I haven't seen it be extensively used, but you can actually swim underwater in the game. Maybe with a key item to breathe underwater, this will be used in some puzzles later, but so far it's just that it's possible. All in all, I'd say Immortals Fenyx Rising is a really enjoyable game. It took a ton of things from my favorite game of all time, so it's already doing great. However, the majority of changes feel like steps back into normalcy rather than iterating on really innovative ideas that might have just been not quite mechanically sound. But after all that, I can't wait to play dozens more hours of Immortals Fenyx Rising, and I'm so thankful to have this opportunity to share my thoughts with all of you. But that's what I think. What do you think? Do you have any questions that you'd like us to answer on our podcast this weekend about this game? We would all love to talk about those questions and answer them from you. Also, are you going to pick up this game? Let me know all that and more in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, feel free to like the video and subscribe to fanatixfour for more videos like this every Tuesday and Thursday for me and AJ. And with that out of the way, I'll see you Thursday.